So now the plan is to have a sort of an open discussion. I will ask some question, but also feel free to raise your hand and we can incorporate your question as well. And also it's okay to have a specific question to just one, but also try to make your question broad if it's possible. But I would like to start with an overall question to all of you. And I'd like to have an answer from all of you. What should I say to a young researcher? What is my publication strategy? How should I do this?
Post-publication peer review, write comments on papers, and take it into your own hands.
I would advise the young researcher to publish in good journals to get the tough scrutiny from a professional set of referees. I think we need to improve the referee system. I think the referees are overloaded, but the referee system, the peer review system, we really need. I think tools like this with the post-peer review process is a good add-on tool. I don't think at all that it will replace good journals. I think the need for good journals is larger than ever, and I would advise the young researchers to publish in high-quality journals.
Yeah, but I would advise young science to publish high-quality science and to resist the danger of cutting corners to get your paper in, because there's only one thing worse, in my opinion, than not getting your paper into a high-profile journal. That's getting a bad paper in. Because everybody looks and you go, how did they get this paper in? Look at this bit of rubbish. And then your actual reputation, she goes downhill. So that's why I try and resist submitting bad papers to good journals, even if my postdocs really want it, because I see my own personal lab's reputation on the side. So I think that's what we really see very much in eLife, is we created this thing where you're not allowed to ask for any experiments that'll take more than 2 months. So we're really trying to push again to the complete paper being submitted, rather than what was being happening recently, I think, is that people say, okay, well, let's see what the reviewers say. We'll submit it, and let's see what experiments they want, then we'll start working on those. And that's what I would say, is to just submit a really good, solid, and complete bit of work.
I think the worst thing that happens at journals like Science and Nature is that a reviewer will say, I think this should only be published if this experiment turns out the way I predict. Imagine the pressure that puts on a young researcher to get that result. It's just terrible. So at Science, we had a policy that those comments are never shown to the authors. But I'm sure that we weren't always successful in screening. But that kind of thing is just an inducement to select your data. And especially in these large efforts with many people depending on you getting this result and you're part of a team. I guess the major thing I want to say is, what's a good journal? I publish most of my work on DNA replication in the Journal of Biological Chemistry, which is a good journal. It's very well reviewed. Genetics is what, most of the society journals are really good journals. The problem we were discussing is that this impact factor nonsense has caused people to only credit papers in Cell, Nature, and Science in certain fields, and those journals are not appropriate for a lot of really good science, and so people's careers are being tortured by these artificial constraints, which are basically our fault, because too many senior scientists, when they look at applications for jobs or grant applications, just too busy. They just see how many Cell, Science, or Nature papers are there, and then they make a certain kind of biased judgment that way, which is a very damaging. It's been extremely damaging. This was not the case when I was a young scientist. I mean, there was really no difference as far as I'm concerned, publishing in Journal of Biological Chemistry or Nature, unless you had something that was really of general interest and you wanted more than biological chemists to see it. At any rate, it was the pressure to publish in only a small number of journals really was not there 30 years ago, and now it's definitely there.
You can say maybe just one thing on that is that young people often surprised when I say, even when I was starting my PhD, it was nice to publish in Nature. It existed, but it had no effect on your career. And so that is a surprising change that's happened, even though all those journals still existed.
Do you have a feeling of when that changed?
Well, we all know exactly where it came from. It came from Ben Lewin, who created Cell. And he created this sort of star system. I think many people felt that when he was in charge, he did a good job. But then when he left, he sold off Cell Press to Elsevier. And then, it started a whole different way of doing it.
At the moment, I think,
Michael.
yeah, I think it's just enormously difficult for early career researchers to do anything different than to play this, to be part of the system that exists. And it's easy to say, be brave and be more open, publish your work sooner, publish good science, don't cut corners. But the one hope I have is actually the people who are in control of the funding decisions are also beginning to change, I think, across the world, and they are getting together. And I think there is a real problem because the funders are changing, the institutional leaders are not changing yet, and there needs to be pressure on them. But I also think that it is going to change, and with more people who are prepared to take that risk, the benefits will come to them first because their work will be more recognized. And ultimately, it's, much of the status quo is maintained by the older generation, and the early career researchers are the future. And I would just encourage you to take your future in your hands and not necessarily keep to the system. So be brave, be open. Ultimately, I think that's where the rewards are going to come, not just in terms of career, but in terms of the opportunities it will provide you as a researcher to collaborate with people when they see your work, when you make it available, when they can use it. I think that brings huge opportunities to you as an individual researcher.
I would say use initiatives like arXiv more widely.
Well, it was sort of an expected answer from some of you. But I would say if you have pre-publication, you have maybe journals or open access, and you have post-publication. Do we need all of them? Or can we skip something?
I can make a comment on that. I think actually in the last talk we heard you gave almost the notion there that we could skip the good journals, and I would severely disagree on that. I think if you look at the situation where millions of papers come out, I mean there is no possibility for an individual researcher to keep track of everything and to keep track of all the comments and to keep track of which could be good in that way. I think the role of actually having a filter system where you have professional things, where you have communication channels where really good research is scrutinized severely, is put into those journals, is a great benefit for the community that we have access to communication channels where we think that there's a good chance to find this really good research. I think using arXiv and stuff like that to have it out early, fine. But the post peer review things is also fine as a tool in this system. But I don't think it at all replaces the role of good communication channels through, if it's journals or something similar. You must have a filter system. You can't demand every researcher to have control over all the million of contributions that are out there. I think it's just impossible.
Catriona had a comment.
Well, I had a question really, is what is a good journal? I think you're right. We need methods of selecting innovative work and work that is good and can be built on. But what we call good journals at the moment aren't necessarily good journals, and there are increasing reports that they're failing science. And so I don't disagree with the principle of what you're saying, but it's just how we package it and how we evaluate that content, I think.
I think actually I would disagree even on that. I don't think the journals actually fail. I think there is a big spectrum of contributions in good journals too. There is crap actually published in the best journals, absolutely, and you have to realize that. But on the average, if you look in any field, I think you will find a pretty good correlation actually in good peer-reviewed journals on the sort of the average quality or probability to find the very good contributions to science, that you find it there. And the good journals is not only Science, Cell, and Nature. I mean, that's a terrible view on this. In every field you have good journals, respected journals. I think it's actually a pretty good correlation between good research. I don't think the referee system has collapsed. I think it's on the verge of collapsing because of the enormous strain on all the referees. I get heaps of papers to review, and I have to refuse to review a number of them. But we have to do something about that. But I think they still do a fairly good job.
Brandon has a comment here.
So I agree with you that a complete free-for-all might be difficult to deal with if things are published all on the preprint servers, and that there must be some, an editorial perspective is useful for discovering science, but I'm not sure that the journals are the best way of doing that, in fact. I think that we could have an editorial process that doesn't involve the journals. And the second response to that is that, like you say, there are great, there are bad publications published in Nature and Cell, but there are also great publications published in other journals. And so, myself, for discovering science, this editorial process, when I read a paper in Nature, I don't automatically assume it's great. And I still go through PLOS One, even though it doesn't have a high impact factor. I still go through, and if there's something in my research that's related to me, I still want to read that. So I'm not sure that I'm not sure the editorial process with the journals is as effective as you hope it is.
But I think actually
No.
But the peer review process also actually improves a lot of papers, I think.
I've already forgotten what I was going to say. Been a while. I think I was going to suggest that if you want to really see what the effect of having a preprint server is on the final published paper, this paper by Ron Vale, if you just go to the bioarchive and type in VALE, you'll see that his paper, between the time he submitted, he put it on the archive and he submitted to PNAS at the same time. And it took, between the time that he submitted the paper and the time that he got his first referees reports back, he had something like 6,000 tweets and 600 comments. And if you look at his final paper that's now going to be published in PNAS, revised, he made use of the comments extensively in his supplement to raise all the points that people raised against his view and try to discuss them. And I think he would argue that his paper is much richer having gone through that experience than not having gone through it. And I just wanted to ask the physicist, my impression is that even though you've had this archive for a long time, most papers that are published eventually in some journal, and why is that? I mean, because this is you're way ahead of us, but yet you haven't gone to a different system.
No, the peer review on the journals still serve as a quality stamp. So, I mean, basically all my papers I've put first on archive, and then I've submitted them to journals, which have mostly been of subscription-based type. It's only the last 2 years that we can have freely published open access without paying with this Go Up 3 initiative.
Now we're gonna let the audience. I have a question back here.
Thanks. I just want to point out that this problem of people publishing for or wanting to publish in Science, Nature, and so on for their careers is an old one. I know a specific case in the early 90s where exactly this happened. Postdoc got an offer of a job at New York University, one of the prestigious ones. If he managed to get the paper into Science, he did. He got the position. 2 years later, that paper had to be retracted because there was a major mistake in it. So it certainly is not a new problem. My other point, or my real question is, the big problem of having lots of papers is due to the fact that CVs look good with lots of papers. So isn't that something we should think about? Trying somehow to get rid of this notion that a CV containing 200 papers is a good CV. Maybe it just shows you produced 100 papers that are crap and the rest that are possibly good. Could we do something about that?
I think the good places have already mandated that, one moves on counting papers. I think if you're involved in a process where they count papers, a very second-rate process, the Howard Hughes, you can only present 5 papers. The Max Planck tries to do that as well. So I think, that anyone who's involved in an organization that counts papers, it should be lobbying very clearly to just be giving the 5 best papers. So Bruce just reminded me of Sidney Brenner's comment that every scientist should be allowed 50 papers in their lifetime. So be very careful about using up your aliquot of papers in that case.
We have one more.
Well, I want to pick up on that a little bit because I think we're all, as scientists, a bit hypocritical. We're sitting here complaining about the system and how we're overloaded and so on. And at the end of the day, we go home and do exactly the same thing again. And the reason is, of course, the way we are evaluated. And I'm thinking about the institutional responsibility of universities and research councils for the way that we are evaluated, because we're just doing what they are asking us to do, to get funded, to get positions, and so on. So what can Arne, for instance, a university do to change it the way you are hiring people, or what can the research council do to change the way you're evaluating proposals so that we get a more balanced system?
Can I make a comment there? We're visiting all the research groups at KTH, and I put out as a little bit controversial thing there, I think you should publish less and think more. And actually, as I said, I think one of our weaknesses is that our academic impact in terms of quality is not up to the standards where I think it should be as a leading engineering university. And that comes to the fact that I think you should go out, you should interact with your peers around the world and discuss your things very well. Publish in archive and so forth, discuss your results, go out to conferences before you try to publish it in a journal, and do a better job when you actually do publish it there, and have something that will survive for a longer time and that can be respected and to be used. And I think we should cut down and not focus on having a large number of papers in each doctoral thesis, for instance.
I just wanted to make 2 points to that. One is, I completely agree. That's what Dora says as well. Makes very clear that young people know exactly what they're evaluated for. So every university should write that down. But also that reviewers also respond to so when the ERC said it had to be blue skies research, and I was on those panels, suddenly reviewers started looking to see if it was blue skies. So you're absolutely correct about that. It's up to the funding councils to define what is innovation, and then we will review for that.
I think it's also a difference between what we as scientists would like to have and what we get from the governmental. In Sweden, at least, some of the money is distributed according to citation, and those you kind of force scientists to go in a direction, even if you maybe want one direction, you go in another because you get less money. So how can you, I think my question will be, how can we affect the government to change their strategy for the evaluation, which I think will have greater impact, maybe?
I think some funders are genuinely changing, and I know that RCUK in the UK, the Research Council, asks institutions to submit papers from that institution, their best papers, and they shouldn't focus on the journal. The problem is actually the institutions are ignoring them, and everyone just still uses the journal name as a surrogate. And we really have to focus. I mean, journals have a function in terms of managing peer review, and no one, I think, wants to get rid of peer review. But peer review can be improved, and we need to be able to value the review process, as Tony was talking about, and actually get reviewers to focus on the content and not on the journal. It's just far too easy for institutions to say, there are good journals, these are the good journals, you know, papers elsewhere don't get published, and if you're below that threshold. Norway now has a threshold system where journals are assigned 1 or 2. So if you're, and funding for institutions is directly related to whether you're mostly publishing in journals ranked 1 or 2. And if you're in the wrong ranking, you get reduced funding. But we know that there are plenty of good papers in perfectly decent journals that aren't necessarily the highest ranked.
We have pre-audience questions, and I think the one in the back was first.
I have 2 questions about archive. So the first one is about preprinting. So if you preprint something, doesn't it actually qualify as something that's then out in the public domain? So do journals actually accept the article after that?
So Ron Vail, I mean, not in physics for sure. Ron Vail points out in his editorial, I didn't know this, that used to be a restriction, but there are now many journals, including Science, Nature, Cell, PNAS, and others who don't have that restriction anymore. So, I mean, I think we should all push to remove that restriction. Another point that Ron Vail made is a very interesting paper. He's, of course, unlike me, he goes to lots of scientific meetings. He says, now at the scientific meetings, nobody talks about their unpublished work. They only talk about their recently published work or their almost instantaneously to be published work, because they're afraid that somebody in the audience is going to get a jump on them from publishing. And he uses that as an argument for a preprint server, so that things could go on, you know, they could go and talk about their preprint. They have, you know, put a stake in the ground for priority. So, you know, that's one of his many arguments for trying to change the way we publish in biology.
Another question I have is about what is perceived to be negative data. So there's a lot of it out there, and no journal probably wants to accept it. So can it be published online on something like arXiv?
Yeah. You publish negative data?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it can be put on preprints, but PLOS ONE will also publish negative results, and we think it's absolutely vital that negative results are published. There's a huge publication bias in the literature. So there's so many positive, significant results in the literature. I mean, goodness knows, you know, how it happens. I mean, it is selective reporting. But many of these positive results are false positives. And that information needs to be there. And again, you know, good journals, apparently good journals don't publish negative results. And of course they don't, because they don't get cited, so it doesn't improve their impact factor. So is a good journal a journal that publishes negative results, or one that doesn't? No.
Well, I can basically answer your question from a physicist perspective. And I mean, once a paper is out on arXiv, it's uploaded to arXiv, and it's have been in the email listing, it's in the physics field considered to, I mean, you can claim priority with that. And the journal reference will pop up eventually if the paper is published on that page of that paper on arXiv, and you will have the quality stamp from that. So priority in the field of physics, at least in my area of physics, it's the time when it was submitted to arXiv, and because basically the whole community uploads their papers on arXiv, and the journals, the technical journals in my field, they even ask for the arXiv preprint number when you submit the paper. And I also know that some journals in the field of mathematics is basically only cover on top of archive. So you basically submit your paper using the submission engine of archive, and they don't have their own submission system. So you basically send them the preprint number from archive.
Okay, we had one question somewhere here. Or no? Okay, it's gone. Let's see. I was thinking that you go to PubPeer and you review something, or you go to archive and you comment on something. That is kind of the researchers go there and are interested in. Do you have some kind of searching for people to actually go there and say, this would be interesting if you, more like journals, I would say that we have reference system and you say, please have a look at this. Do you have anything like that you would, do you get my question?
So is your question, do we have a way of discovering science at PubPeer?
Yes, that would like to comment on certain research. For example, if you see a lot of comments, maybe you would like to have someone who you know knows a lot about this. Do you ask them actively, or do you just hope that they will browse this kind of problem by themselves?
So one of the things that we're the most excited about at PubPeer right now is kind of this editorial process and giving scientists a way of discovering new science and things that they might be interested in commenting on. This is what we're working on right now. I think that answers your question.
Yeah, and I was asking the same kind of question to archive. Is that
What's your question? How you,
are you
identify
identifying
the interesting research in the field? Well, in my field, it's very easy because, as I told you, the whole community submit the papers and manuscripts to archive. It means that there is only one place that I need to look for the interesting papers, and that's archive. And I get every day an email listening with all the new papers.
But I was thinking,
that covers the field.
And I understand that because physics have been around such a long time. But I was thinking, if you want to go into a new archive subject area, how can you get that community to start commenting? I mean, now you're kind of well established in physics, for example. But in other areas, I mean, social sciences where you don't have an area at the moment, how can you get them to, even if there is a new moderator group, how can you say, okay, let's go there, and there is where you start?
I guess that you have to inform the community.
I just wonder whether you couldn't generate some kind of community rating system for these archives so that certain things would pop to the top, like in, what was it, Stack Overflow and those things. Is anybody doing that?
This is something that we're working on. This is exactly what I meant with this kind of editorial process. We think we have a clever way of doing that. But one thing that we really want to avoid is creating another metric. You know, we don't want to have another metric that's going to replace, you know, the previous metric.
You don't want the friends of the author naming it either.
Yeah, well, we have solutions for that.
I mean, it is a real problem. Anyone interested in P53 is going to have a really hard time reading the list of papers about it. But I also think the work being done on text and data mining now is also going to enable discoverabilities of papers. But again, that relies on actually the papers being available and text and data mining being allowed. So I think there's going to be a suite, and recommendations are going to be hugely important, and recommendations from people that you trust will be especially important. And so it's not just any recommendations, but if you can identify the people that you want to flag interesting papers, then I think that will be the solution.
Yeah, and we have a question here.
It's an archive and PubPeer question combined. So as I understand archive, there is no commenting function on archive, correct?
The microphone.
There is something that I've actually never looked into that, but some blogging that they are collecting data for that. Maybe you can.
So you can comment on the archive via PubPeer.
Okay.
And that was my follow-up question. You're based on digital object identifiers. So how do you comment on archive? Because they don't have those, do they?
No, I mean, every preprint on archive has a unique number.
Okay. So it has a DOI as well?
At present, it's a four-digit number.
Yeah, sure.
With a dot and then a 5-digit number. It's changed from 1st of January this year. If you're, it used to be 4 + 4. Now it's 4 + 5.
Actually, there was also a recent announcement by Crossref that they're going to allow DOIs to be applied to anything to preprints. And I think that will have a huge impact as well. So it means that if you have an institutional repository or a preprint server, those articles can have a DOI. And also Crossref they're actually using PLOS software for the article level metrics, but be able to track what they call DOI events, whether it's a mention in Wikipedia or tweet as well. So there's going to be a suite of indicators or metrics around how much preprints are being used.
One thing I think is going to be very useful for PubPeer is also the members of the public asking scientists questions about their papers, because that's a real problem. I noticed that we published something on Parkinson's disease recently, which showed that Bulgarian yogurt might be good for Parkinson's. Of course, I got a whole of Saxony writing about, and they were trying to email me, but it'd been far better to have had that done as a post-peer, PubPeer. So you can answer, and over and over, and people can read the blog on that. And one thing I've really noticed, this is why I just so keen on open access, because if you have had a family member who's trying to work out why there's a disease, and you see them trying to find the literature, and it'd be completely impossible. It's just immoral, basically, that they can't access the taxpayers' paid research for that.
So just to clarify your question, I thought I pointed this out in my talk, but maybe I skipped over it. You can take the archive ID off of an archive paper or preprint, put that into the PubPeer search bar, and then that will come up. You don't need the DOI, it's just the archive ID, and you can comment on the archive via the archive ID.
And short replication of the archive.
So we had the annual meeting of the member advisory board in archive last week in New York, and then we actually discussed this with the DOIs for archive preprints. As far as I know, DOI cost money, so we would. I think that it was decided that we would investigate the possibility of actually putting on archive the possibility for the authors themselves to actually buy the DOI, and then it will be printed for each single version, because every version of a preprint will be a different object.
No, it's okay.
Just one follow-up on that. So some of the PubPeer comments themselves become these huge like reviews for an article. And sometimes people want to cite these also. And so it would be possible to put a DOI, to let users put a DOI on their comments that then could be cited in the literature. They are turning up to be cited in the literature. There's a few citations for PubPeer comments right now, but you have to cite the URL. And if the DOI was there, then it might make it a little bit easier. So it's possible for anywhere commenting. But you're right, you have to pay for it.
Okay,
And
now we have
follow up. What is the cost for a DOI? How much does it cost?
So there are different distributors of DOIs, and they have different prices.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I think one of the main problem nowadays is that the problem with the peer review. We have no appropriate substitution for the peer review. On the other hand, we don't take consideration for improving the peer review. I could not find any course during the PhD studentship, for example, for the peer review, to teach peer review, and it's just only doing learning by doing. This is one problem that I have seen, and what's your idea about that? And the second problem is that we do not credit peer review. So the reviewers are doing the reviews free of charge by their time, just only convincing themselves that, okay, so they might learn something. And now maybe you heard about the Publons that is gone now, that they are started to collect this review and maybe their aim is to credit the reviews down per page for researchers. So what's your idea about the future of this crediting to peer review?
I, of course, couldn't agree with you more about that. I think crediting reviewing in whichever way you do it is essential for the future of peer review, by which I mean not only peer review of papers, but reviewing grants, all reviews. It's remarkable, for instance, in NIH, you can have a whole lifetime of getting NIH grants and not have to ever serve on an NIH study section. You know, I mean, why? It's not like jury duty. You get called, you get called. It's sort of very unclear. For instance, I think those systems of trying to collect what you did for peer review be too complicated. That's why I advocate you serve on a review board for which you're either paid in money or you, for instance, get given another year on your grant, or there's some way that you are actually compensated for it in a direct way in which you can then write down, served on the editorial board of this journal in your review system. And without that, peer review will definitely collapse. And so that's, yeah, I think you had some.
I just wanted to give you a partial explanation why so many peer review comments that you get back are so nasty. Because I actually, at Science Magazine, I could see all the reviews. And I'm convinced that, so when we ask somebody to review, we give it to, I mean, generally they give it to a well-known scientist. That well-known scientist is very busy. So he or she gives it to 3 graduate students or postdocs in that lab. Those 3 postdocs write reviews, and if the PI is lazy, you get back all the obvious things. These postdocs or graduate students are trying to impress their professor that they are really smarter than this other scientist whose paper they're reviewing, and so they're trying to find everything that could be wrong with this paper. And you get these hellacious reviews that really reflect the psychology of a young person trying to protect their professor. So how I know this happens is some reviewers, they're so lazy they don't even read what their graduate students do, so that they paste together 3 reviews and it all starts over again 3 times. I have nothing against giving your graduate students that kind of opportunity. It's probably good training, but you have to then do the work to decide what is reasonable to. You have to know the psychology of your graduate students and postdocs to find everything critical they can, and you got to put yourself in a position of the author, and you don't want to keep on transmitting that stuff, and yet we do. So there's a pathology in peer review that has an obvious source, in my opinion.
So I think Publons is great in terms of rewarding reviewers, and I agree. I've seen the same on numerous different types of papers. There is a real problem, and there's no incentive for anyone to write a constructive review when actually, especially for something like Science and Nature, where it's the competition that are about to get their paper published there. But in order to assign credit to reviewers, we need open peer review. They need to have their names signed, and I think that will also create a much more constructive atmosphere. I know a senior scientist at Sussex University who spent years not signing his name on his reviews, and he got fed up with the amount of negative comments that he was receiving, and he made a commitment to, and this was when he was much younger, to only ever write, to sign his name on every single review, whether it was positive or negative. And I asked him, well, how did this change your behavior? And he said, well, I said the same things, but I just said them in a much nicer way. And I think it would change the tone. I also think, just saying what Bruce says, is the experts that we think are reviewing your papers, or you think might be reviewing your paper, are often not. They're the graduate students, and they don't have time. And we need more eyes on every paper. And I think the Ron Vale's example there, getting a whole suite of really constructive comments from people because he put his paper on archive, and even the PubPeer comments, shows that when you are make your paper available, and where you can get comments from a whole suite of different type of people, it's actually better for your paper. So we need to both credit reviewers, we need to open up the review process, and we need to enable more people, and actually also speaking to Tony's point, not just scientists necessarily on some papers, to review it, to review the articles.
We have an audience question now.
So Tony, I would guess, and I think I've asked this question, I'm sorry, having the eLive reviewers see each other's reviews and know who they are and discuss it, I assume you're getting much better reviews.
Yes, I mean, I've never had a single pejorative review ever as my time at eLife. It's really amazing. It's completely cleaned it up. It doesn't have to be seen by everyone or the author, it just has to be seen by your colleagues in the reviewing process.
Okay.
I mean, pejorative reviews are uncomfortable, right? And we would like everything to be kind of roses, but at the end of the day, it's not the end of the world. I mean, as long as the scientific comment comes out and people...
No, sorry, by pejorative I mean ad hominem, critical in a way that's not, you know, it's fine to criticize the science. Of course, I have very critical reviews, but not the sort of, this is terrible or this can't be true, you know, that sort of stupid comment you tend to get.
Now it's time for the audience.
I have one question. You were talking about the importance of changing the research council structures and so on in order to improve the academia. And that coupled for me with an idea of, well, a lot of the young people that you say are important for innovation are actually in education. So what is the role of the educational programs in adopting, let's say, peer review, because there are journal clubs running in educational programs, or archiving their own research paper, progress papers, and so on, and what initiatives are being taken? Thank you.
A lot to do, a lot to say there. Well, you know, I think we need to do more to prepare people for the real life of science, and for now, increasingly, different kinds of careers. So graduate programs are starting to introduce optional training of all kinds, and how to write grants, how to review papers. I don't know what's happening in Sweden, but UCSF we have a whole menu of stuff. And in addition, since we know now that probably less than half of our PhDs will go on to get real research jobs, either in academia or in industry. We have a whole program to give them an option to leave UCSF for 3 months, sometime during their graduate career, to go to a non-academic environment. Basically, I think those of us who are faculty members have to think about the next generation more broadly than we ourselves were thought of, because in my generation, everybody was getting an academic research job, basically. And that's not true anymore. And many of the professors are living in a world that doesn't exist anymore. We need to educate the faculty.
Thank you. And now sorry, but we have to cut this interesting discussion. But I would like to encourage all of you to keep this discussion on Twitter with the hashtag #PubandParish. And I also would like to thank all of you who had taken the time to come and speak to us today and taking part of this discussion, and you will get a small gift with you from the Young Academy of Sweden. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.